The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Provides. I'm the tutor of RC14. And so this is the fundamental lecture series. And last week we had learned about AI, machine learning, and also the history of urban design. This week, Philip was supposed to talk about computation first, and I decided that I will talk about media and culture. Cool, but with a little twist. So it's not just fundamental. I want it to be fundamental. So media, it cannot escape the talk of millennial, which is this age, memes, which is what's circulating on the internet, and morphology in urban design. So this is the usual pipeline when we do an urban design project. We identify problem, we map out the problems, we understand our users, we try to set our goals, and then we start designing, we produce variation, we test the variation, and then we make a design decision, and then we fine tune it to produce a final design. So this is what I intend to structure my talk around, but in a more fun manner. This is double diamond diagram. When I was a teaching assistant at the public policy department right next to Bartlett School of Architecture, I first encountered this diagram and I never knew what it was, but this is apparently called design thinking. So it's basically abstracting ways in which designers design and then try to communicate it with people who are not designer, so then they can understand how design thinking works. And it's very simple and easy. It's diverge, converge, and then this double diamond goes on forever. So it's like what we're doing in a thesis. We first research. So then it will give us a lot of questions, and then we define, we set goals, and blah, blah, blah. So this is one picture I want you to keep in your mind for the rest of the talk. So when Matt Olst asked me to deliver a fundamental lecture, I thought, that's a very difficult question. What is fundamental? So I Googled it, and from Oxford Languages, it means a central primary rule or principle on which something is based on. So then I thought, what are the rules in urban design? And I came across this. This is an advertisement made by Bernard Tschumi in 1976. I love this. So what it says here, look at it this way. The game of architecture or urban design is an intricate play with rules that you may break or accept. These rules, like so many knots that cannot be untied, have the erotic significance of bondage. The more numerous and sophisticated the restraints, the greater the pleasure. And thus, it is the rope and rules. And the most excessive passion always involves a set of rules. So why not enjoy them? So in case anyone who doesn't know Bernard Tschumi, this is Bernard Tschumi from his website, an architect, writer, educator, and company associated with deconstructivism. Widely recognized as today's foremost architect, known as a theorist, and drew attention to his innovative architectural practice in 1983 when he won a prestigious competition, Parc de la Villette. It's basically a cultural park. This is one of the first things we can see within deconstructivism as an urban design, even though it consists of the design of architectural components, but distributed within an area. So modernist planning was the fundamental in this design because we can see that the plan is open, it's clean, it's structured. At the same time, it's postmodern, post-mo, because it punctuates the principles of fundamental and modernist, and then turn the whole plan into an exploration, movement, interaction, and discovery. So with the fundamental language of dot, line, and plane, Tschumi reconfigured the park as a space of culture, a series of follies, a sense of place, and a system of distribution. But of course, Tschumi doesn't take a park as just nature, human synthesis. It sees it as activity, culture, and it tries to map people riding bicycle through the park and thus distribute its architectural component and make an urban design. At the same time, I love Tschumi because he always managed to imagine users that are of otherness. For instance, a murderer. So what he's doing here in the Manhattan transcript is that he was imagining a murderer dragging a dead body across the city and thus map out how the city will look like, which is fragmented and deconstructed. And then he begins to have more advertisement asking the very fundamental question, like what is architecture or what is urban design? And this is what he said. To really appreciate architecture, you may even need to commit a murder. Well, why is that? Because architecture is defined by the action it witnessed as much as by the enclosure of the walls. So if you murder someone on the street, it's different from murder someone in the cathedral, because on the cathedral, you can push someone off the cathedral, but you can't push someone off the street. In the same way, love in the street differs from the street of love, poetically. So then what is urban design? For Toomey, it's about the common ground because architecture is a discipline, urban design is a discipline of knowledge. It's not the knowledge of form, but a form of knowledge. At the same time, it's not about the condition of design, but about the design of conditions. As Manos have showed last week, this is a fascist architecture, but the building alone does not compel the assembly, but the assembly compels the space. So urban design can be the juxtaposition of words and images, each a manifesto of sorts that confronts the dissociation between spatial experience and the analytical definition of theoretical concepts. So these trigger desire for something beyond the page itself, and the advertisement are products that advertise architecture. So why not we advertise for the production and reproduction of architecture itself? And most importantly, what Toomey is doing is that it's basically aligning a series of arguments, ideas, influence, and response to contemporary definition of architecture and urban design. Now, contemporary is very important here because without contemporary understanding of society, we cannot gain insight into how city may be developed and thus design for it and even project for the future. So how do we develop a contemporary understanding of society? Well, we understand a demographic, but demographic, it's not just about age, gender, height, salary, family, where you live, where you pass away. It's also about the cultural preferences, the aesthetic that is embedded within the demographic. So what I'm trying to say is that GDP is one way of measuring it, and we've been using it since the end of the last World War, but it's a little bit narrow and non-inclusive as a social measuring index for our time. So what other index do we have? We've got something called social demographic index. So it tries to use another way of indexing to evaluate social demographic. And it's based on average income, educational attainment, total fertility, a little bit more inclusive than GDP. How can we do better? We've got social progress index. So it measures extent to which countries provide for the social and environmental needs of the citizens. So it's not just about money, not just about consumerism. Now it's trying to look at the environment. So if we put all of these mappings together, you begin to see patterns. And in RC14, a lot of the exercise, we start with mapping because it's only through this Marco understanding of relationship between parts, then we start to understand and begin to grasp the larger part. But we also begin to notice something, which is that every single statistic looks like this. This is my favorite meme from 9gag. But why is that? This basically triggers into what we call nowadays as global north and global south. And it's something that's called a cartographic realism, which is a cognitive tool for orientation, not only in space, but also simultaneously in time, as a tool for planning, but also for preserving and relieving. So this is a sort of diagrammatic imagination and the external epistemic diagrammatic tool of the cartography. They're complementary in creating orientation. So basically, you can understand this saying in terms of 4 aspects. There's orientation, there's a generation of fiction, there's a contested representation, and the dark side of the map. So every time we try to map something, we need to develop a consciousness over how this map is read, how this map is used, how it's projecting information, and what information it's not showing. For instance, this is one of my favorite useless map. It's a world map according to a fish. I can't even begin to recognize the Earth. But you see there's a North Pole, there's a South Pole. This is what we call a post-human mapping. So we try to understand our world according to perspective of others. And then an Antarctic-centric worldview, and suddenly all the continent looks like decorative planes floating without any meaning. But of course, there's alternative map of fiction. But at the same time, these fiction actually tell us something about the real world that we have not noticed before. I don't know if anyone noticed this map. This is basically from the Game of Thrones. And you can begin to see that based on real-world map, it tries to fictionalize, but then at the same time reflect what has happened in history. For instance, the fight between Scotland and England in the 15th, 16th century, the fight between France and England for the Long War. And throughout this fiction, it tries to abstract how the worldview has changed because of these contested events. But it's not only metaphorical. I'm not sure if anyone recognizes this place. Okay, this one is a real place. It's basically Russia. So when I was doing research in Russia, I then realized that actually, if we project the map very differently, it gives a different feeling of how big the Russian continent actually looks like. So no matter if it's orthographic, Mercator, or Lambert projection, there's an awareness and a connotation embedded in it, even though it tries to be scientific. And this is what it's called contested representation, because it affects the way in which people understand space. Finally, I wanted to show how United Nations choose the North Pole perspective because it tries to unite and not try to overemphasize the size of one over the other. So actually, how did map and cartography become popularized? It's not just because there are government sending agents or rich guys in the Enlightenment trying to look for new land, but at the same time, popularization means that normal people can also reach these tools, that these tools are democratized. That actually the rise to new cartographic means of orientation came from 19th century Europe, and it's because of tourism. So this is actually a guidebook that will guide French tourists to visit Europe. And it is from this that there begins more data generated from mapping. It's not yet big data, but then it's not just one map. Now it's becoming a lot of different maps. So one may begin to understand the dark side of the map. So what is not appearing on the map? A Russian writer, Dostoevsky, Grand Tour of Europe, basically sketched alternative map of Western civilization from the perspective of the underground man. So this tour guide basically unmapped the non-sites, and the text described the pollution, the squatters, the squalors, the mass tucked away behind the facade of nationalistic and capitalistic self-fashioning. This is what is called a dark tourism, and it takes us to London Haymarket to observe the drunkens, the prostitutes, and the young going wrecks. So the 19th century literature reinvented the map as a diagrammatic tool of the sites and non-sites, and warned us of the realism in the cartography with which we produce that reproduces reality. Mapping is the first step of any urban design initiatives. We must develop a conscious use of the tool as an apparatus. So now we're here. The next step would be to understand our users. Now, of course, one of the main demographic nowadays is the millennial. So millennial is a period of 1,000 years. And millennial is not only important as a time marker, it is also important for its cultural connotation. For instance, it denotes people like me and you, kind of. I'm not sure if you guys are younger than 1996. But yeah, if you're not, then we're the same demographic. Anyway, it's not just me and you. It's about the demographic of the demographic, the constituencies and the sub-constituencies. So what does it mean by that? It's actually a more just term for subculture. And that includes the health golf, the sea punk, the brony, the juggalo, the doomsday prepper, the Fragitarians, the Pescatarians, and architects. Yes, we can be called a cult of the working dead. And we're so tired because the nature of the job as an urban designer is to juggle the conflicting interests and values of different stakeholders and users. What does it actually look like? So this is called the trolley problem. It's a thought experiment in ethics about a fictional scenario in which an onlooker has the choice to save 5 people in danger of being hit by a trolley by diverting the trolley to just killing 1 person. So this is a genre of decision problem. And urban design, it's all about making decisions And this thought experiment was actually invented by Philippa Foot when she was considering the problem of abortion. And the same method has been used by the MIT moral machine so that it generates a big data set of what people think is moral, and thus it may be used to guide ethics of artificial intelligence. So if you have time, you can go on their website and start clicking on answers. For instance, would you rather drive the car here and kill everyone in the car? Would you let the car drive straight and kill everyone on the crossroads? Difficult. But today, the same trolley problem has evolved with contemporary media and jokes. For instance, the millennial dilemma. This actually came from an interview by an Australian real estate agent. So he's kind of like really rich. And then the guy was interviewing him, like, what does he think of young people nowadays? What are the opportunity of them buying a home? And he would say that, well, if they stop buying avocado toast, then they would be able to afford a home. Of course, that caused a big backslash on the internet. But so the meme develops. The millennial dilemma is either having avocado or either having bread. It shows the inflation of society in recent years, and either way, you would not get your home. Or from the perspective of the central bank, would you actually give mortgage to millennials or to baby boomers? This is funny because baby boomers are my mom. And it is said that my mom's generation, they would not buy avocado toast, but then they would get the home. So you see, if you want to give a chance to the young people, you have to give mortgage to them, but then at the same time, they keep buying avocado toast. Okay, I'll start explaining the jokes. So as you can see, there's so many variations of the same meme that actually reflects urban problems and issues nowadays. Sometimes having fun and looking at memes, it does help us to understand what is the urgency. And the more time this meme evolve, this is called a morphological variation. So what does morphology mean? According to a dictionary, it's the study of form of things, how things are put together, a different or distinct form or version of something. Now, that sounds very familiar because there exists on Earth an occupation that suffer heavily from morphology obsessive disorder. And those are architects, obviously. Now, here's one of them, very satisfied at his architectural morphology. And this is the social impact that may be produced. So if you're good enough, you would have known that by the time you finish building the house, your client would have been divorced. So he even designed for that. Okay, I was joking. So because of the morphology, he has to force a split in the double bed of the main bedroom. So anyway, morphology is about differential copying, the differential replication that becomes a sort of social consensus. So meme always come in plural, memes. It is only through the morphology that memes gain its cultural inheritance, its cultural momentum, and thus becomes funny. But it didn't start off as something funny. It actually came from this book, The Selfish Genes by Richard Dawkins, that coined the term meme in 1976. So what he proposed was that human culture was composed of elemental units that are like genes, and that there were copies of a copy of a copy. And Dawkins' idea is that humans do make amazing design, but if you look at the projects in detail, you see that human cannot design if they don't fill their brains with these immaterial substance called information, which are like genes, except they're not passed down by blood, they're passed down through ambient culture. So you get it from your friends, from the society in which you've been raised, especially for architects. We get a lot of ideas every day. And when we wish to fill our heads with immaterial culture aspirations, then I've got a secret for you. You go and look at Charles Jing's diagram of evolution of architectural discourses. We can basically pick one and make a project out of it. But anyway, the point being that design requires perception. It's never singular. And this is how it's showing evolutionary thinking within architecture and urban design, where every period is traceable and you see how it's developing from one stage to another. So this is a quote from Dawkins himself. He said, well, actually, what you have to know is that meme came from a Greek root. It's a monosyllable that sounds a bit like a gene. And then he said, I hope my classicist friends will forgive him if he abbreviate meme to meme. If it is any consolation, it could alternatively be thought of as being related to memory or to the French word meme. So just to briefly summarize, meme is the element of culture, system of behavior that may be considered to be passed down from one individual to another by non-genetic means, especially by imitation. A unit of information transmission, a unit of cultural differential replication. This means that one does not simply understand meme. One has to understand the human culture and the philosophies of living to understand meme. And of course, this has everything to do with architecture and urban design because one does not simply design without understanding who they're designing for. So understanding meme is a display of high intelligence. So if you do not laugh at the meme I show you, it means that you're probably not displaying a form of high intelligence. So please laugh. Okay, anyway. So memes are genes. And in order to understand how meme evolve as a cultural tool, it will help to look at how genes evolve. So does anyone know who is the father of evolution? I basically have that on the screen. Okay, I'll pretend you answer. Yes, it's Darwin. So some of you might already know him. He's a 19th century biologist who looked at the science of evolution, and he proposed an evolutionary process called natural selection. And there are four main points. First, there's variation, meaning that organisms within a population exhibit individual variation in appearance and behavior. Inheritance, so traits of organisms are consistently passed down from parent to offspring. Differential survival and production, but also a high rate of popular growth. So all of this contemporary trend about Creative Commons, open source, big data is really dependent on high rate of population growth. Let's unpack what this means. It means that if you only have one meme, it's not funny. If you have a morphology of meme, it's an engineering of social consent. Now, I would really recommend you to look at this book by Edward Barney. He's actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So he writes all about urban psychology. If you want to know the history of how we get to here today, this is the book that I recommend. But also by reading this book, it will help you to understand the historical context to which Toomey actually made this architectural memes. Okay, before we start diving into what it means for architecture and urban design, just want you to remember that morphological variation is established on the principles of the fundamentals. So you morph from the fundamentals. It's about the differential replication that structure a topological consensus. At the same time, it's about differential copying, differential replication that becomes the social consensus. So how can we understand it within the context of architecture urban design? Very familiar piece of history. So this is Eisenman with his House 5 that we've talked about. But what he actually get his idea from is from linguistic and grammatologies from Derrida. So the way he thinks about deconstructing fundamental architectural language, he tries to reference interdisciplinarily from linguistic and semiotics, in which semiotists try to deconstruct cultural meaning and semantics in language and expressive means. Now, of course, morphology of architecture morph itself, and we start entering into the era of curve. So from Greg Lin, he tries to develop embryonic form, which was deconstructing network theory and translate that into architecture and looking at how points may connect into these curved shapes. All of this has a basis in Le Corbusier, of course, because everyone is deconstructing from modernist architecture, the House of Domino. Now, if you want to learn more about this, of course, you would look into Mari Karpel's book, The Second Digital Turn, which basically mapped the whole journey from Renaissance, where we started inventing perspective, all the way to modernism, where we have the standard module, all the way to deconstructing the standard modules. But the story doesn't end there. So this is what we call deconstructivism in architecture. Now, of course, there are 7 star architects from the MoMA exhibition in the 70s, and those includes Frank Gehry. Zaha Hadid on the left is her earliest drawing of Hong Kong, and then 20 years later, he built the building in Hong Kong. Amazing. And then we have Bernard Toomey, Manhattan Transcript, and his urban design project. We have Coop Himmelblau looking at more organic way of skeleton steel frame that represent organic movement, but within architecture form. We have Rem Koolhaas, who wrote Delirious New York, which was a surrealism and critical paranoia sort of writing. And then 30 years later, he built on the theories of building as a city, the CCTV tower in Beijing. Peter Eisenman, from his housewife to actually building the Museum of Housewife. And finally, last but not least, we have Daniel Lipskin, who deconstructs the sensorial experience of walking through a museum into using the architecture and helping you to understand what it's like during the Nazi era. But all of these actually are not working in silo. It is in tight connection with art movement, with music movement, and with philosophy, including that is actually a Picasso that uses cubism to deconstruct traditional painting. And that was the original painting coming from the Oriental era, including Sahadi, who draws a lot from suprematism. And of course, looking into how colors express emotions rather than just form. And we have Situationist International, which basically looks at how consumerism and the way we identify with ourselves basically course the way in which we understand a city and navigate it. Now, that has a lot to do with critical theory in social dynamics at the time. But of course, we have cybernetic theories that goes into understanding how feedback, control, and communication between parts becomes an interactive and self-adaptive system. Now, when we talk about Rem Koolhaas' work, I mentioned critical paranoia, and that's from the movement of surrealism. By placing two distinct objects together in a setting, it creates an imagination, a fantasy that's beyond the object itself. So this is also another very significant art. Basically tells you this is not a pipe. It's trying to help you understand the representation of an object versus the object in itself. Now, one of the first person who builds a parametric pavilion is Ioannis Xenakis with Le Corbusier. Ioannis Xenakis uses spatial dynamics to actually map out musical scores. The scores sound horrible to human ear, but it makes every sense in a post-human era. It might make sense to machines. It might make sense on a graphical representation. It's just not for the human ear. And of course, based on that such exploration, they built one of the first parametric pavilion in the world. And finally, we have Duchamp, who shows you a urinal and tells you it's an art piece. So at the same time, it's trying to test out the limit of what something is and what something can be. And of course, by the same artist, he tries to deconstruct time and map something which is four-dimensional on a two-dimensional plane. Now, of course, we know that perspective is something architects and urban designer has to be familiar with, but what if we try to orient our perspective differently? And this is the interdisciplinary exploration. So what are the counterpoint to all these evolutionary thinking in design and evolutionary thinking in culture in general? So every good thesis must provide a counterpoint. And of course, it's obvious. This is my counterpoint. Orientalism. Western scholar established this discipline in the 18th and 19th century that encompassed the study of language, literature, religion, philosophy, history, art, architecture, urban design of Asian societies, especially ancient ones. So Orientalism by Edward Said, it's a book in 1978. The author established the term Orientalism as a critical concept to describe the West's commonly depiction and portrayal of the East, i.e. the Orient. So what this is that it's operational image that established the foundation of colonialism, and it persuades the West that the East is in need of help and it's often savagery. This is a painting in 1855, and it's basically portraying Indonesian people in their hunt. It's very rich in color, it's very passionate, but at the same time, it's very savagey, it's very brutal. You have blood, animals with humans mixed together. Another example, a depiction of Arabic culture full of sex, prostitute, woman in low status. I love the brushstroke, but then at the same time, you can see that the snakes and the silk, all of which are mixed into one image. And these imageries constituted to an evolutionary thinking in culture and society, that there are definitive start and definitive end for all culture. Basically, it means that you're either more advanced or less advanced, but you're not on separate course. So it's projecting the otherness as savages, undeveloped, and thus need help, which is the fundamental to colonial thinking. And we also see in urban design. I love this paper by Smith. He is not an architect. He's actually an anthropologist and an archaeologist. What he does is that he collects all of this ancient mapping to early cities and then compare them. So in the more Western or modernist thinking, a grid would mean there are signs to that the city has been planned. And planning would mean that there's a significant level of maturity in the civilization. And obviously, a lot of African cities, ancient African cities, they do not have a great plan. And thus, in the old times, they would analyze the city by its level of civilization through ways in which the grid has been constituted. So this paper tries to overturn this way of thinking about the world by proving that you don't need a grid to be civilized. So some final takeaway. How are these games of rules and ropes be broken and untied within the pleasure of urban design, no matter if it's the rules of colonialism or the rules of modernism, the rules of constructivism? Now, according to Benjamin Brereton, one of the ways in which we try to mix keywords together, and that's why I always say, try to make your keyword meaningful and not generic, because by the language hybrid, we start to have something new which may appear. It can be a combination of familiar things. For instance, a car is a horseless carriage. A handheld computer camera plus wireless data is a mobile phone. And information technology plus it within an urban setting is a smart city. Blockchain is more or less digital money. So our formal and vernacular language are starting with horseless carriage metaphors. In the short term, the hybrids may make sense by way of analogy and continuity, but soon they will create confusion and even fear as the new evolves and resembles the familiar less and less. Hybrid terms delay recognition and defer understanding of what requires our most audacious attention. So after mixing in words, we have to establish the framework. And this is the modernist, postmodernist spin. So at the end, you see the history of urban design. On the top, you see the future of urban design, because history always repeats itself. We go from structure to post-structure, from modern to postmodern, to structure to post-structure. So by mixing it new terms and new things, there needs a moment to which we establish a new model to which we look at the world. And if we go back to Benjamin Brereton, this is his model of looking at the world today, going from user, interface, address, city, cloud, earth. And this is also an interdisciplinary exploration, because technological stack is actually from knowledge within computer engineering, computer science, computer programming, where they would first draft out a tech stack model, so then the rest of the company would know how to put components together. And then he very marvelously took this stack and then translate that to urban design. And he calls this a planetary infrastructure. So it's not just about one city, it's about the planet. So the model governs the techno-political space in which in turn govern the development of the urban and its designs. At the same time, there are danger in model that are simplistic, even though simplistic models help us to understand better. For instance, this is the political compass. You have on the right and the left. So if you ever go and visit the UK Parliament, you will understand why some people sit on the right, why some people sit on the left. I think last time I asked in class, most of you don't understand, but this is where it came from. The right is the conservative, the left is the radical, the communist, and then you have authoritarian and libertarian. And then what people does is that it tries to map out different leaders on this political compass to understand their political orientation. So you'll be able to see Reagan here, which is quite close to Hitler, because National Socialist, Nazi, is conservative and authoritarian. But of course, if you try to map yourself on the political compass, you may find that this compass, this model cannot be inclusive to everyone on Earth. How can we be oriented just two-dimensionally? And most of the time, people are like this. But even though the compass may not be accurate, it can act as a source of inspiration. For instance, in fully automated luxury communism, what was proposed is that when technology have advanced so much that we may have access resources, much like how Marx have proposed a century before. And then from that, we may be able to have a fully automated luxury communism if we develop a universal basic service from such automation. So it's about urban design, not just about the plan, not just about the diagram, but a model thinking about how we may govern ourselves with new technology. And finally, you may try to work on your own model. I actually made this for fun when I was a student at the Bartlett, which is trying to turn the political compass in 3 dimensions and maybe into a sphere where all of these points are topologically equal in probability, and thus we're not prioritizing one over the other. Okay, so that's just some thought for you to think about. And if you're interested to know more, welcome to get in touch with me. So yeah, this is the talk. Thank you so much. Hope that was fundamental.
That was fun, for sure. And fundamental as well. Thank you. That was great.